my soul free. We are stardust, we are golden, we are billion-year-old.
Hi, I am Debra Cohen, and I'm glad that you're here. This is the week of Passover, or Pesach 2023. And for those that support interfaith dialogue, it's also Easter Sunday for Christians. So you're all welcome to be here. If you are on twitch.tv/Debra Cohen Music, the chat box is open. And if you're on my Facebook profile, you can also chat there. So I will be back to talk about a promise of the land right after this message.
Shalom Aleichem, Malachi Hashalei, Malachi Elyon. Mi Melech Malkei Hamlakim HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Boachem LaShalom, Malachi Hashalom, Malachi Elyon.
And again, this is Debra Cohen, and I welcome you here. Today's discussion is based on a Haggadah that you can purchase, written by Rabbi Ellen Bernstein, and it's called A Promise of the Land. I'll show you a picture of the promise of the land, a Passover Haggadah. Today we're going to talk about what is God promising his people. It's more than coming out of Egypt, but Dayenu, that would have been enough. But there's more. There's more promises about the land, and for some reason we don't hear about them in this day and age, 2023. So let's dive into this study and talk about it. Adonai brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Getting out of Egypt was not the hardest part. We would spend 40 years wandering in the wilderness before we could receive a land where we could set roots, grow our own food, and finally be free. It would take all that time to heal from the condition of slavery that we inherited in Egypt. In Egypt, Pharaoh owned and exploited the land and everything in it: the fruit trees, the animals, the gold deposits, and us. In Pharaoh's ownership economy, people and creatures were commodities to be bought and sold. If we were going to inherit a land, we would need to honor the dignity of all people, all creatures, and the land. God freed the Israelites not just for our sake, but for the sake of the entire creation. The land and its creatures belong to God. Curious about the land's place in the Bible, Rabbi Ellen Bernstein ran a quick word search and was surprised to find that the word land itself, actually two words, Adamah and Eretz, appears more than 2,500 times. Perhaps the ubiquity of land in our text prevents us from actually seeing it, the same way that we easily lose sight of the ground or land upon which we walk. With more study, I began to understand the whole truth, says Rabbi Ellen Bernstein, starting with the Garden of Eden as the story of a people and a land. In the beginning, we Israelites were landless. Then God made a promise to Abraham and to Isaac after him and to Jacob and all the subsequent generations that we would inherit a land that we could call home. En route to the promised land, we would endure 400 years in Egypt, where Pharaoh owned and exploited the land and everyone in it. For Pharaoh, land had no inherent value. It was a commodity. Utilizing slave labor, Pharaoh increased the land's agricultural output, amassing more and more wealth for the royal coffers. Living so long in Pharaoh's exploitive economy, we, the Jews, would come to forget the meaning of the land. If God were to give us a land, we would need to recognize the land's incomparable value. God took us to the wilderness for 40 years to teach us that land, the earth, was not a thing, it was not ours to acquire, and it was not guaranteed. Land, people, and God were imperceptibly bound in a three-way covenant relationship, knit together as one. What does all this have to do with our Haggadah, the story of Passover? When the instructions for what would become the Seder were written down in the 2nd century CE, the rabbis stipulated that, along with drinking 4 cups of wine, asking 3 questions, and by the way, originally there were 3 questions, not 4, discussing Pesach, matzah, and maror, and reciting psalms and blessings, we were charged to read one biblical passage in its entirety. That passage encapsulated the Jewish story and can be summed up like this. My father was a wandering Aramaean. We went down to Egypt and multiplied there. The Egyptians imposed harsh labor on us and oppressed us. We cried out to God, and God heard our voice. God led us out of Egypt with signs and wonders. And God gave us a land. And now we bring the first fruits of the land, which you, God, have given to us, which you can find this promise in Deuteronomy 26, verses 5 through 10. So make a note. But by the time the actual Haggadah was composed several centuries later, the last 2 verses, in bold if you're watching live, the 2 verses about God gave us the land and the first fruits of the land, those 2 verses had been dropped. What is the nature of these 2 verses, and why were they dropped from the Haggadah? 1, and God gave us the land in Deuteronomy 26:9. The days of slavery, oppression, and wandering were over. Now we would have a land to inhabit and care for, a land in which to grow our food and pasture our animals, build our shelters, and live our lives. Land meant freedom. There's nothing more valuable than land. 2, and now we bring the first fruits of the land, which you, God, have given us, according to Deuteronomy 26:10. Each spring, when the fruits were finally ripe on the vine, we would set aside the first, most perfect ones for God. That which was most precious to us, we would bring to God as an expression of our gratitude for the land and our recognition that God, not us, is the owner of all land and everything in it. In the words of the psalmist, quote, "The earth is Adonai's in all its fullness," end quote, according to what is written in Psalm 24, verse 1. In returning the fruits to God, we were participating in the eternal round of giving and receiving. So the ecological message of the Haggadah. Well, the rabbis didn't explain why they deleted these 2 verses from the Haggadah. We can possibly infer the very first instructions for the Seder, including the 2 verses, were probably written a generation or 2 after the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, 70 CE, when, even though many Jews had scattered to other lands, there was still a sizable Jewish population in Israel. These 2 verses assume the Israelites were living in the land of Israel and offering the fruits of that land in the Temple of Jerusalem. But by the end of the Bar Kokhba rebellion in 135 CE and the Roman occupation of Jerusalem, Many more Jews were living in exile and had no land to which they belonged. But by the 3rd century, these verses may have been omitted because the reality of life in exile was so far from the vision of what Jews thought they had been promised, a land where they could dwell in peace and safety. Yet without these 2 verses, it's easy to forget why God chose to free us from slavery in the first place. God led us out of Egypt because God had promised us a land so that we could live as a free people. But we would only inherit the land if we honored our covenantal relationship by living good, wholesome, and righteous lives. If we behaved unethically or irresponsibly toward each other, the land, or God, we could lose the land. Without these 2 verses, it's also easy to conceive of God as a triumphal deity and the Israelites as the passive recipients of God's largesse. These 2 verses portray God as a partner in a dynamic reciprocal relationship with a people who are actors in their own destiny. Said Rabbi Ellen Bernstein, realized that by retrieving these 2 verses and returning them back to the central Jewish narrative, the Passover Haggadah could convey a profound ecological message. Rabbi Ellen Bernstein, offer them to you here with the hope that this Seder can remind us of our deep ecological heritage, inspire us to rejoice in the fullness of the earth, and lead us to live lives that honor Hamakom, the one whose presence fills every place. What is the promise of the land? The promise of the land refers to the primary blessing that God gives all the ancestors in the Bible, Eretz in Hebrew, or land. That the Hebrew word Eretz means not just land, but also earth, conveys a profound ecological sense. The land, or earth, is the home of the swimming creatures, the flying creatures, the walking, climbing, crawling, hopping, sprinting creatures, and us. The land, the earth, is our habitat, and we are its inhabitants. Land, or earth, is the most precious blessing a people can receive. It is the source of sustenance. It is the promise of life, the promise of freedom. Unfortunately, many people regard land as lifeless and inert, real estate to be bought and sold, or territory to be acquired and owned, and many Jews conflate land with the land of Israel only. If people view land this way, the whole subject of land invariably turns economic or political, and the deeper ecological meaning of land is lust. When we approach the Seder with a broader appreciation of the land, its spiritual, aesthetic, and ecological value, the Haggadah reveals its deep environmental meaning. We could not own the land because land has a life of its own. We were to treat the land as a commons, which everyone could share and enjoy together, just as we all share the air. We were to see ourselves as God's tenants, guests on the land. The hardest lesson for us to learn was that the land could not be guaranteed. If we neglected the land's need for rest every 7th year, if we forget the Sabbath, if we avoided giving to the poor, or hoarded the land or its produce, our behaviors would reverberate in the land. And one day, the land might be unable to endure our indifference any longer. The land may have no recourse but to spew us out. If we wanted to dwell freely in the land for generations, we would have to know what farmers have always known, that caring for land is a matter of life and death. It requires dedication, perseverance, and love. Listen to these quotes from various people about the land, starting with Malcolm X. Quote, "Land is the basis of all independence. Land is the basis of freedom, justice, and equality." End quote. Quoted by Malcolm X. Talk about it. Can you be free without a connection to land? How might slavery be connected to landlessness? Talk about it in the chat. If you're on Facebook right now, I can see your comments. And if you're on twitch.tv/Debra Cohen Music, I can also see your comments in the chat. So now that we are talking about the land, the promise of the land, the earth to all of God's creatures, and specifically Israel for the Jewish nation, I'd like to talk to you about a song that I used to listen to at the time Woodstock, USA was popular. Some of you might know about Woodstock if you're a baby boomer like me. And some of you younger generations may have heard about it because I see on social media that the Beatles are coming back again, which were popular when I was a teenager. As I've seen Jimi Hendrix coming back, who played at Woodstock, Janis Joplin, all those hippie groups that I used to listen to. And one singer in particular, Joni Mitchell, wrote a song about Woodstock. And when I used to listen to this song, I think Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young made it popular too. The lyrics, I really only listened to them from the location perspective of Woodstock itself because of the name of the song, Woodstock. But as I've pursued the spiritual journey on earth and revisited this song in 2020, I noticed that Joni's lyrics are talking about, I'm going to get back to the land and get my soul free. And I thought, surely she's talking about the land of Israel and the Jewish nation. And the interesting part here in 2023 is when I searched for the lyrics for this song, Woodstock, I noticed that some of the words have been changed.
I came upon a child of God. He was walking along the road, and I asked him, "Where are you going?" This he told me, "I'm going down to Yesker's farm, gonna join in a rock and roll band. I'm gonna get back to the land and get my soul free. We are stardust, we are golden, we are billion-year-old carbon, and we've got to get ourselves back to the garden. Then can I walk beside you? I have come here to lose the smoke, and I feel to be a cog in something turning. Well, maybe it's the time of year, or maybe it's the time of man, and I don't know who I am, but life's for learning. We are stardust, we are golden, we are billion-year-old carbon, and we've got to get ourselves back to the garden. By the time we got to Woodstock, we were 4 million strong, and everywhere was song and celebration. Hey! And I dreamed I saw the bomber death planes riding shotgun in the sky, turning into butterflies above the nation. We are stardust, we are golden, we are caught in the devil's bargain, and we've got to get ourselves back to the We are stardust, we are golden, we are caught in the devil's bargain, and we've got to get ourselves back to the
This is Debra Cohen, and that was my version of Woodstock. So I want you to think about those lyrics and wonder, maybe. We got to get back to the garden. We got to get back to the land to set my soul free, wrote Joni Mitchell, until some peoples today decided instead of singing, we've got to get back to the garden to set my soul free, they say we've got to go camping, or just look it up on Google. They've changed the words to camping, which takes away the spiritual meaning of what this song is about. From my perspective, it's about getting back to Israel, to the place that God promised all of us. And the promise is the land, but it's not free. It's on condition that you live a life righteously for the Holy One, Adonai Elohim. So thank you for listening. I hope this message touched your heart in a deep and profound way, and that you will look at Pesach, aka Passover, in a much deeper way than simply or just coming out of Egypt, which Diana would have been enough. But there's more promises, the promise of the land. Let us be mindful of the land, take care of the land, take care of one another, because after all, in the end, all of us are going to return to the land physically, so let it also be spiritually.